On the 4th of August, 1892, the temperature in Fall River, Massachusetts, climbed toward 100 degrees. It was one of the hottest days anyone there could remember. And in a narrow wooden house on 2nd Street, a house with no proper corridors, where every room opened into the next, where the doors between the bedrooms were kept locked and bolted from both sides, 2 people were killed that morning, about 90 minutes apart. The first was Abby Borden, killed upstairs in a guest bedroom. The second, about an hour and a half later, was her husband Andrew, a wealthy, hard, widely disliked old man, killed downstairs on the sitting room sofa, where he had lain down for a nap. Nobody in the house heard anything. Nobody outside saw anyone come or go. The doors were locked. The windows were watched by neighbors sitting out in the heat, and there were other people in that house, awake the whole time. One of them was Andrew's 32-year-old daughter. Her name was Lizzie. She was the only person known to have been in the house for both deaths, and she was the only one who could not give a straight account of where she had been. The day before, she had tried to buy poison. A few days after, she burned a dress in the kitchen stove. She was arrested and tried for both murders, and the jury acquitted her in about an hour. This is one of the most famous unsolved crimes in the history of the United States, and the strangest thing about it is not the killings or even the verdict. It is what Lizzie Borden did afterwards. Because she did not run, she stayed. Before we begin, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from, and if forgotten stories like this one are the reason you're here, subscribe. This is all we do. This is the Borden case. To understand this case at all, you have to understand the house, because the house is the case. Andrew Borden was one of the richest men in Fall River. He had made his money in undertaking, in property, in banking, and by the 1890s, he was worth a very great deal indeed. And he lived like a man worth almost nothing. He had no interest in comfort or display. The family home at 92 2nd Street stood not in the fashionable part of town where men of his wealth lived, but on a cramped, ordinary street near the mills, among people far below his station. It had no bathroom. It had no gas lighting for years after his neighbors had it. It did not even have a hallway. The rooms simply ran into one another, so that to get from one part of the house to another, you had to walk through somebody else's room. And because of that layout, the doors inside the house had locks and bolts on both sides. The family lived, in effect, in a series of small sealed boxes stacked against each other. Andrew Borden, his second wife Abby, his 2 grown unmarried daughters, and their Irish maid all lived in that house, in the heat, behind locked interior doors, and they had been doing so for years. It is worth sitting with that for a moment. This was not poverty. This was a rich man choosing to keep his family in a box. Andrew Borden was 70 years old, and he was not loved. He was famously hard in business, famously tight with money, and the town's opinion of him was low, even by the standards of a mill town used to hard men. His first wife had died when his daughters were small. He remarried, a woman named Abby, and the daughters never accepted her. Emma, the elder, and Lizzie, the younger, referred to their stepmother formally, not as mother. They had lived under the same roof with her for nearly 30 years, and the relationship had curdled into a permanent Cold War. And the war was about money, as these wars usually are. Some years earlier, Andrew had transferred a property to Abby's side of the family, and his daughters had taken it as a declaration that their father intended to hand what should be theirs to a woman they regarded as an interloper. There were arguments. There was a settlement of other property on the daughters to calm things down. It did not calm things down. By the summer of 1892, the household had divided into armed camps. The daughters ate separately from their father and stepmother in the same small house, at different times, and passed each other in silence. Lizzie was 32. She was unmarried, respectable, deeply involved in her church, active in charitable and temperance work, the very model of a proper New England spinster of good family. She was also, at 32, entirely dependent on a father who kept her in a house with no bathroom on the wrong side of town. In the days before the 4th of August, the tension in the house rose sharply. The whole household, except Lizzie, fell violently ill in the night. Abby Borden was frightened enough to go across the road to the doctor, convinced they were being poisoned. Andrew, characteristically, dismissed the idea. It was more likely bad mutton left out in the heat. The family had been eating the same joint of meat, reheated, for days in temperatures near 100 degrees. But Abby's fear was on the record before anything happened. Lizzie's sister Emma was away, visiting friends out of town, and on the 3rd of August, the day before the killings, two things happened. A relative arrived to stay, an uncle, John Morse, who was connected to the daughter's late mother's family and who had been in conference with Andrew about business. His visit did nothing to ease the atmosphere, and Lizzie Borden went into a pharmacy in town and asked to buy prussic acid. She said she wanted it to clean a sealskin cape. The pharmacist refused to sell it to her without a prescription. She left. He remembered her. That evening, by the account of a friend she visited, Lizzie spoke of a sense of dread, that something was going to happen, that her father had enemies, that she feared for the family. Then she went home to 2nd Street, and everyone went to bed. The morning of the 4th of August was already hot at breakfast. The household ate, Andrew, Abby, and Uncle John, and John Morse left the house to visit relatives across town, an outing that would give him one of the most complete alibis in the history of American crime. Andrew went out into town on his business rounds. In the house were Abby, Lizzie, and the maid, Bridget Sullivan. Bridget was set to washing the outside of the windows in that heat, which kept her outdoors and moving around the house. Abby went upstairs to the guest room to change the pillowcases. And at some point that morning, the medical evidence indicated well over an hour before her husband, Abby Borden was killed there, in that room, on the 2nd floor, at the front of the house. Nobody heard it. Bridget, outside, heard nothing. Lizzie, in the house, said she heard nothing. Andrew Borden came home late in the morning, having had some difficulty with the front door, which was locked and bolted. Bridget let him in, and, this detail became famous, she heard someone laugh from upstairs as she struggled with the bolts. Lizzie said she had been in the kitchen. Andrew, tired and unwell in the heat, lay down on the sitting room sofa for a nap. Bridget went up to her attic room to lie down for a few minutes, and somewhere in the next 10 or 15 minutes, in a downstairs room of a locked house, Andrew Borden was killed where he lay. At a little after 11, Lizzie called up the stairs to Bridget to come down quickly, that someone had come in and killed her father. This channel is not going to describe what was in those two rooms. It is enough to say that both deaths were caused by repeated blows from a heavy-edged weapon, that the attacks were sustained and ferocious, and that the images taken in that house are among the most notorious photographs in American criminal history. We are not going to show them, and we are not going to detail them. The people in those rooms were somebody's parents, and they have been reduced to a nursery rhyme for 130 years. That is enough. What matters for the case is what the house told the police. And what it told them was almost nothing. There was no sign of forced entry. Nothing had been stolen. Andrew's watch and money were untouched. The doors were locked. The neighbors had been out in the heat and had seen no stranger enter or leave. Abby had been killed well over an hour before Andrew, which meant that if an intruder had done it, that intruder had killed a woman upstairs and then waited, silently, inside a small occupied house for 90 minutes while a maid moved in and out and a daughter went about her mourning, and had then killed a second person and left, unseen, in broad daylight, covered in the evidence of it. That is not impossible, but it asks a very great deal, and the police, standing in that hot little house, began to look at the family instead. And the family, specifically, meant Lizzie, because Lizzie's account of her own mourning did not hold still. Where had she been when her father was killed? In the barn behind the house, she said, in the loft, looking for lead to make fishing sinkers. It was one of the hottest days of the year, and the loft of that barn would have been a furnace. An officer who went up there said the dust on the floor was undisturbed. And she gave more than one version of what she had been doing, and for how long. She had been eating a pear. She had been looking for iron or lead. She had come in and found her father. She said Abby had gone out to visit a sick friend, though no message had come, and Abby was in fact lying dead upstairs at the time. Then, days after the killings, and with the investigation running, Lizzie was seen burning a dress in the kitchen stove. She said it was stained with paint and had been ruined for months. It may well have been, but the timing of it is the kind of thing no defense lawyer ever wants to explain. Add the attempted purchase of prussic acid the day before, add the money, add the household at war, and there was, from the police point of view, only one direction to look. Lizzie Borden was arrested and charged with both murders. The trial opened in New Bedford in June of 1893, and it was a national event. The newspapers had been at it for 10 months. Reporters came from across the country, and the woman at the center of it sat quietly through the proceedings in black, self-contained, occasionally fainting, and mostly unreadable. And the prosecution's case ran straight into 3 walls. The first was the evidence itself, all circumstantial, no witness, no confession, no weapon that could be tied to her hand. A hatchet head was recovered from the cellar, but it could not be conclusively connected to the killings. And in 2 attacks of that violence, there should have been physical evidence on the person who committed them. There was none on Lizzie. No stained clothing was ever produced. To believe she had done it, you had to believe she had also cleaned herself completely and disposed of everything in a small house with a maid moving about in a matter of minutes. The second wall was legal. Lizzie had given testimony at the inquest before her arrest without counsel present and while under the influence of morphine prescribed by the family doctor for shock, and that testimony was the most damaging material in the whole case because it was where her account had wandered. The judges ruled it inadmissible. The jury never heard it. So did the failed attempt to buy prussic acid, excluded as too prejudicial and not sufficiently connected to the deaths. The strongest parts of the Commonwealth's case were taken away before it began. And the third wall was Lizzie herself, or rather, what she looked like to 12 men in Massachusetts in 1893. She was a church-going, charitable, respectable, unmarried lady of the middle class. The jury was being asked to believe that such a woman could pick up a hatchet and do that to her own father. In that time, in that place, it was very nearly unthinkable. The jury retired. They came back in about an hour, not guilty on all counts. Legally, that is the end of it. Lizzie Borden was tried and acquitted, and no one else was ever charged. The case remains formally unsolved to this day, but there is a distinction this channel has run into before, and it is never more visible than here. There is what the law decides, and there is what a town decides. And Fall River decided the opposite. The verdict was greeted in much of the press with relief and approval, and in Fall River itself with something far colder. The people who actually knew the family, who knew the house, who knew there was no way in and no way out, drew their own conclusion and never revised it. And Lizzie, now a wealthy woman, inherited half of a large fortune and did the thing that has puzzled people ever since. She stayed. She bought a large, handsome house on the hill, the fashionable part of Fall River, the very neighborhood her father had refused for decades to live in. She named it Maplecroft. She had the name carved into the front step, which the town considered a piece of showy vulgarity, and she moved in with her sister Emma. She began calling herself Lizbeth. She had, at last, the life the money had always been able to buy and never had. And she lived in it, in that town, for 35 more years, among people who believed she had killed her father and stepmother with a hatchet. They cut her. Shopkeepers served her without speaking. Old friends from the church she had given years to fell away. Children shouted the rhyme at her house, that vicious little jingle about 40 whacks, which was invented by somebody unknown, and which is wrong even in its arithmetic, and which has outlived every fact in the case. She traveled and bought books and art, and befriended people in the theater world, which the town also disapproved of. Her sister Emma eventually left Maplecroft after some rupture the two of them never explained, and the sisters, who had stood together through the worst thing that can happen to a family, never spoke again. Lizzie Borden died in 1927 at 66. Emma died 9 days later. They were buried in the family plot near the father and stepmother who had died in that hot little house on 2nd Street 35 years before. More than a century on, the argument has never stopped, and everybody has a version. The straightforward theory is that Lizzie did it, that a woman held in a state of arrested adolescence at 32 in a locked box of a house by a father who controlled every dollar and had begun signing property to the wrong side of the family, finally broke. It explains the sealed house, the absent intruder, the shifting story, the burned dress. What it does not explain is the physical evidence, or rather, the total absence of it. The competing theories are numerous, and some are serious. That Bridget Sullivan, the maid, did it. A young woman made to wash windows in 100-degree heat, worked hard, with a grudge and complete freedom of movement. That Emma came back secretly, that Uncle John's alibi was too perfect, and perfect alibis are a thing worth noticing. That an illegitimate son of Andrew Borden's existed and came to the house. That it was an intruder after all, a stranger with a grievance against a hated businessman who got lucky twice. And there is a persistent and sad theory that Lizzie did it in some kind of dissociated state and genuinely could not afterwards give a coherent account of her own mourning, which would explain a story that keeps changing without a liar's usual care to keep it straight. None of them can be proved. The house is still there. It is a museum now, and people pay to sleep in it. The hatchet head sits in an archive, and the two people who were killed have been almost entirely erased by the fame of the woman who was acquitted of killing them. What stays with me about this case is not the mystery. It is the 35 years. Imagine the version where she is innocent. A woman loses her father and her stepmother in the most violent way imaginable on an ordinary Thursday morning, and then is arrested for it, and tried for her life in front of the whole country, and acquitted, and then has to live out 3.5 decades in the same small town, walking the same streets, being served in silence by people she had known since childhood, listening to children chant a rhyme about her in the road outside her own house. That is a life sentence handed down by a jury of neighbors who never sat in a courtroom. Now imagine the version where she is guilty. She got everything. The money, the fine house on the good side of town, the freedom, the name carved in the step. And she got it in a place where every person she passed knew what she had bought it with, and she chose to stay there for 35 years rather than take the fortune and disappear into a country that had a whole continent to hide in. Whichever version is true, the choice to remain is the most human and least explicable thing in the entire story. The doors of that house were locked from the inside, and 2 people died behind them, and the only people who could tell us what happened were in the house at the time, and are all long dead. Andrew Borden, Abby Borden, not a rhyme and not a puzzle, a hard old man and the wife his daughters never accepted, killed in the heat, in a house with no hallways, in a family that had stopped speaking to itself. And a woman who was found not guilty, and stayed, and was never once forgiven. If this story stayed with you, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. And if you believe cases like this one deserve to be remembered, subscribe. The next one is already coming.